Well, with all the talk about what is going wrong, the spiraling fuel prices and other socio-economic ills that we're struggling with, many South Africans are pondering many questions about where this country is actually headed. Now, the dominant and growing narrative about South Africa is that there's no singular event that can lead to mass employment and a significant reduction of crime levels. And whether it's a Mandela type president, the Soccer World Cup, ANC conferences, a vibrant opposition, the country's woes just seem to persist. Now, the question to be asked is, does the country's liberal constitutional project of 1994 to 1996 need to be revisited? And these are the challenging questions and some of the issues in an article penned by TK Pooe, who's a public policy specialist who is with us now, as well as Mametlwe Sebei, who is the president of General Industries Workers Union of South Africa, or GIWUSA. And gentlemen, thank you so much and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So very tricky questions, but let's try to traverse through them as best we can. Starting with the question, TK, that you talk about in your article about a failed state. Perhaps we should start by looking at some of the characteristics of a failed state and then asking whether we as South Africa bear those hallmarks.
Yeah, it's important. I put it out as a question in the article, and I was simply saying, in public policy, there's a growing field, which one is specialized in, which says failure analysis, which simply says, when do we know something is not working and when do you know it's failing? This is quite common in engineering. When you build a bridge, you stress test it. You say, if it reaches this level, we know it has failed. Now, within the context of South Africa, there's three key markers you can use, namely education, health, and an economic model. Let's go to first stage of first education. Now, we know we spend a lot of amount, our GDP, I think it's about 2 to 3, on education. But if we're to ask, what's the actual outcome of our education? Do we have graduates? Yes, we've got graduates, but what happens to them? You only have to look at the recent march where graduates are marching. So the question seems to us, if you're a graduate who's marching, are you studying simply to get a job? Are you not creative? Are you supposed to be a creator of a job? Or if you look at our lower grades, which is what something's particularly ignored, how do they do with maths and science? I don't have to give you the answer. We all know how that works. And if you look at health, now health is probably the most we all know about it, but it's probably the most underreported. We all know of stories where in Gauteng, the department has been accused, and I have to just say accused of spending X amount and has actually run out of money. If anything, what is ignored in the issue is how are our nursing and our doctors doing if you know there's a shortage. Now, which is a bit odd because, you know, doctoring or being a doctor is probably one of the easiest signs you can tell of how many are graduating. We know what the shortage is and we should know how to fix it. But our simple solution seems to be, well, let's get people from Cuba to come do it. Forgetting the fact that, look, these students are going to still have to study an additional 2 years. So in that interim, what's happening to our rural areas and our rural hospitals? We know for a fact that there's certain doctors who are working without equipment. And let's go to, I think, the one where most people feel it the most. If a state, we're not saying government must play a role in everything, but if a state cannot ensure that people have the ability to put food on the table, should we not then maybe start saying, listen, we are really heading towards a failure? What is our economic development model in South Africa? And this is, I know people think economic development model is a big term. I'm simply asking, what do we as South Africa do as a state which we import and which gets us money? Take away gold, take away the mining sector, which is dwindling. What do we do? And the question for the last 20 years is we don't know what we're doing. We pick so many things. We say NDP, New Growth Path, X and Y, but we don't know what we excel in. And hence we have the levels of unemployment we have amongst youth. And if all those things are negative, surely we have to say the state is failing.
So, Mametlwe, as a union representative, where do you think the unions come into this discussion? And do you agree with that assessment that South Africa as a state is failing?
Yes, I mean, for us, I mean, the crisis of leadership in this country, as in the world at large, can be, brought down to the crisis of the working class leadership. And I'm saying that because, for me, the past 25 years, and this is that, TK has mentioned, I mean, of mass unemployment, but not just mass unemployment, the fact that we are seated with 3.5 million young people who are not in education, not in training, not in any form of employment. And of course, over 2 million of our people are, without, decent housing, are on the waiting list for, RDP houses. And, all these indicators, what they confirm is a crashing, failure of the global capitalist system in this country to deliver on the promise of better life for the great majority of the, of our people. And I'm saying it's a working class leadership because the system of capitalism represents no way out of the suffering of our people. And what we need is a working class organization that can begin to provide the fighting alternative to the crisis of massive unemployment, to the crisis of lack of access to education, poor quality service delivery in working class communities and all of that. And I think for me, the summit that we are organizing as SAFTU on the 21-22 is part of our response to that crisis.
Well, and this, of course, when we get into that terrain of looking at capitalism as a failed system, usually it becomes a dichotomy between either capitalism or communism or socialism. There should be another way. Have we looked at enough of the other possible solutions that could exist in this space, TK?
This is where I think models come in. Not to forget, I think, what the gentleman has said beside me, but I think this seems to be the normal narrative. What he said, I can cut and paste and say this is what they've been saying for the last 15 years. You just have to put X party and Y organization. The issue, yes, you cannot ignore the issue of capitalism versus socialism. The issue at the point is to say we live in a context, and the context is you need to be able to make a product, get it to market. That's just the simple. Now, you can get into the philosophies of capital and socialism. That's not really what the issue is. And I'll just maybe veer the conversation towards, it talks about the lack of leadership. He says worker leadership. Well, what do we mean by worker leadership? If I'm not mistaken, the current president of the republic comes from a worker-based union. You might have a problem with it, but what was a former NUM. My article and many of the things I've written about says what we actually have is, I call it misleadership. We throw the term around leadership as though, oh, you're not Mr. Kina, you've been elected, you're a leader. That doesn't make you a leader. What I like about the alternative you're speaking about, I'm looking about Rwanda, Singapore, and even China, they basically say, listen, what has been your performance over these X amount of years? Now, they don't get into the philosophy of whether it's capitalist or socialist. They say, what works for our people? And if you look at what most research is saying, especially about young unemployed graduates, is the issue is not that they don't go through a system of education or that they don't even get to varsity. The issue is that the skills they have is not good for the market. Now, what use is it to critique the market, to go on and pander and say the market is wrong? If that's what the market is saying, what we should be asking, what the proper leadership of this country should be stating is, listen, how do we get South Africans who are young, 35 and below, to actually be able to play in the global context? Now, there are different models you can follow. But before we can even do that, we need to ask, do we have the right political leadership, even union leadership, to do that? And this is where I think the problem seems to be. I think there's a lack of imagination amongst people who are in leadership across the board, that they all sing the same hymn and sheet that it is capitalism, it is socialism, we go on and on and on. But no one actually asks, what's the actual problem facing South Africa in the context of the globe? We make this assumption that South Africa is special. We're not special. In fact, we're not even the 10 top largest economies. We should be an export-led country. And we're actually just playing around with money. And until we get to the level where we say, listen, we have a crisis of people who should not be in leadership. And by not, I mean in terms of qualification, in terms of age and experience, they've got nothing. All they have is they've got a long history of struggle. But when you get to and you see them and you sit them in front of, dare I say, the Chinese leadership, you just only have to read what the Chinese leadership think of South Africa. They just see us as another place where they can basically dump their products. And this makes us question, then what's the point in actually going on and on until we have the proper leadership that can actually define what our problem is and actually plug South Africa into the global, I don't want to say capitalist system, but the market. Then I think we're going to keep going on and on about, basically, we call it navel gazing. We're not going to actually define what the problem is.
Mametlwe, I'll give you a chance to respond to this as a leader yourself in a union, and also just to touch on some of the questions that you highlight there, TK, about some of the qualities that we ought to be looking for, and how should we be viewing countries like China, and what can we learn from them, and what should we do to try and avoid being sucked in, and as some would say, being colonized all over again by a different colonizer? Some of the questions we'll ask after this break.